introduce you, why don't you tell us about your background and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Joel Miller, product designer at Figma. I've been at Figma for about 2 years, based in London. Before that, I actually didn't study product design. I was a graphic designer, so I went to the University of Leeds, studied graphic design there for about 4 years, and then decided to work in a design agency. So I think when I was in university, I had this idea, like, I need to go work in a big design agency with like a big name and grind my way to the top. But the reality was that I didn't have a good portfolio, so I had to just take any old job which came to me. So I got this internship at a really small agency in Preston, where I'm from, and had to work for free for a couple of months. And then wasn't doing the most interesting work, to be quite honest. But it was like my first job. It was, exciting. I was actually a designer. And then I decided to move to London because I wanted to try and get in with a bigger agency. So I moved to an agency called MASH and did more web design there. And after 3 years of working in design agencies, I kind of found it a bit not really for me. It wasn't really fulfilling my what I wanted to get out of design. So I ended up moving over to tech because I kind of wanted to focus more in-house, be responsible for a brand, really own something end-to-end. So I moved to a company called Paddle, which is essentially a Stripe competitor, but it focuses more on software companies rather than just any company. So I worked there for about a year and a half, and whilst I was working there, I started to get this itch to kind of be more involved with the product side of things, even though I was in the brand side of things. So I always caught myself having conversations with product managers, product designers, always asking them what are you working on? What's the product strategy? Where are we going this year? And it just kind of clicked one day. I was like, I should really be doing product design instead. So I decided to switch to product design. I was thinking about doing it in Paddle and decided to go work in a smaller company instead. And I came across a company called Visly. So Visly was really interesting because they were focused on designer and developer collaboration, but more on the developer side of things. So the product was aimed at basically building a design tool for developers so that you could create React components visually instead of using code. Because a lot of developers actually don't really enjoy necessarily doing all the sort of pixel pushing, which designers enjoy doing. They kind of find it really frustrating and gets in the way of what they actually want to do. So we were focused on sort of building this design tool for developers for about 2 years. And then just before we did a public launch, myself and the team, we got acquired by Figma. And so that's how I ended up where I am today.
So an acquisition, acquihire.
An acquihire, yes. Yeah.
The story you tell of starting in agencies and then moving in-house, that's quite a familiar one. I think a lot of people have done. Actually, could I get a show of hands? Who here works at an agency? Okay, hands down. Who here works in-house? That's a pretty good mix. Who here works in-house but used to work at an agency? Right? See, it's quite a common trajectory. Is that because you kind of like the working on one thing and getting to iterate on a thing rather than every few months you're on something completely different?
Yeah, I think I was just really frustrated that most clients just didn't want to put the effort in to see a brand through to the end. It was always you present this really nice brand, this nice storytelling, this beautiful website with content designed for specific amount of character length and things like that, and then you pass it over to the client, and then they just dump their crappy blog in it, and it just breaks everything. So that just really grated on me after a while, and I kind of thought, okay, if I'm in control of this, that won't happen. So that's why I made the switch.
On the other hand, working in-house, you're working on the same damn thing every single day.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I didn't stay too long.
All right. Okay. All right, so let's get into Figma, into the nitty-gritty. So you were an acquihire from a company that came from more a dev perspective, say, into this design tool. And now Figma has auto layout, which is a very kind of dev sort of concept to be bringing into a design tooler. Where do you see Figma sitting in this kind of intersection between the design, the pixels, and the code?
Just before I answer that, how many people are familiar with auto layout and use auto layout? Okay, so who doesn't know what auto layout is? Anyone? Okay. Okay, so for some context, Figma is basically based on CSS. So CSS is the default layout language for the web. And because Figma is a web tool in the browser, we aim to default to this. So most of the time, we kind of default to how CSS works in the browser. But in some scenarios, it doesn't really make sense because it's in a design tool context. And also because CSS has a bunch of properties. Some of them are kind of weird in terms of their terminology.
Don't diss CSS.
I'm not trying to diss it, but some of the terminology used is a bit unintuitive or can feel a bit unintuitive. And all the properties don't necessarily make sense to add into a design tool. So on the editor team, we have this principle of adding what we call a thoughtful subset of CSS. So auto layout's a really good example of this. So auto layout is essentially based on Flexbox, which is a CSS layout model, but it doesn't include all of the properties. It's not a direct copy of Flexbox. So if you think back to when, for those who don't know what auto layout is, it's essentially a way to efficiently lay out things in a design tool. So instead of placing things just directly on the canvas where you want, you sort of apply auto layout, and it has some like predefined rules. So it can go in like a horizontal row, or it can go in a vertical row. And if you remove things, it resizes to automatically like fit the container it's in. So it makes it really speedy and efficient, and it's very close to what is in code. So when the team was working on auto layout originally, they could have just looked at Flexbox and say, hey, that makes sense. Let's just dump that into the editor. That sounds good. But it would have been really confusing because as designers, we're used to being able to place things anywhere on the canvas, even on subpixels. And auto layout is the opposite of that because it's essentially following the rules of code. So we introduced it in a way which we thought wouldn't stop that sort of freedom of exploration, but it would still bring in some kind of efficiency and superpower to a designer. And so with each iteration, the first version was about making, if you're making a button component, if you add a really long text string in there, you want it to be able to resize, so you don't have to sort of like resize the text and then resize the container. It should just automatically happen because it's just a lot easier. And then the next version, we were thinking more about, okay, so what if you have sort of like 3 components combined together and you're making maybe a card or something, and you want that to grow and shrink, and you want to be able to align that in a certain way. So that was all about bringing in more alignment. And then the 4th version, which is the one that I most recently worked on, that was more focused on more nuanced layout. So imagine you have a tooltip and it has a little like pointer at the top. You had to really hack your way around that to use auto layout. So we introduced some more CSS properties like absolute positioning, even reverse stacking order, so you can create avatar groups and have negative spacing and have them overlap and things like that. But all the time, we're thinking about a thoughtful subset of CSS. We're trying to be intentional with the properties that we add. We're thinking about usability as well. In fact, the last version of auto layout that I worked on was primarily focused on usability because we found that a lot of designers struggled using auto layout.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, so I see auto layout and, Flexbox and a lot of the new things that have arrived in CSS as almost part of a movement, a kind of declarative approach to design where, like I say, you, the human, set the boundary conditions. Never go below this, never go above that. And you let reality, take over. You get those long text strings, you get that. And you let the machine do the mathematics to figure out how many pixels that should be. But to a certain kind of designer, does that feel like relinquishing control if they're used to, like say, sub-pixel control over something?
Yeah, I think it depends on what stage of the design process you're in. So if you're very much like exploring and you'd want to quickly get out a bunch of different ideas, I don't think it really necessarily makes sense to design using auto layout. If you're familiar with code or Flexbox, then maybe it makes sense for you to design using code or design using those properties. But I think a lot of designers probably aren't used to that. I don't think like that. We want to be able to quickly place things around and move them around, but have that freedom. However, if you're closer to production and you're getting ready to make something ready for like handoff, then it makes way more sense to use something which a developer is probably going to be familiar with and construct a design in a way that they'll understand. So it's a bit more seamless.
It's interesting. It feels like two things are kind of approaching a common center, because you got the design tools like Figma, historically about pixel perfection, becoming looser and more CSS-like, more dev-like, dev-friendly. Meanwhile, the dev tools in browsers have gotten quite powerful, not just on the technical sense, but on the design side in terms of exposing, grid lines and color wheels and all this stuff. Feels like maybe there's something's going to meet in the middle there. I guess you're betting on the ideal design tool comes from this end, evolving the design tool to become more like the dev tools.
I think it's about sort of slowly introducing paradigms which are better for like designer-developer collaboration. So like what's going to benefit from a common language. And I think it's more around, things like auto layout, using components, because components exist in code as well. So using the similar terminology like variants and props and things like this makes a lot of sense. So I think it's those kind of areas that if we can build on top of that and make those things really good, then the exploration side can stay very designer focused, and the logic side can stay very code focused. But it's more like that bridge in the middle.
It certainly makes a lot of sense when you're designing for the web, where CSS is the design language. But presumably people use Figma for things other than the web, right? People design native apps in Figma. Does that in some way hold you back, in that you've got to consider all these different use cases? It's not just the web as the final delivery point. It could be, a native app. It could be something quite different.
Yeah, that's true. We do have like scenarios where we adjust it for things like iOS. So, the first thing I can think of at the top of my mind is that if you have a corner radius, you can actually control like the corner smoothing, because that's a thing you can do in Swift, but you can't do that in CSS. So there's like elements throughout the editor which are for that, but primarily I think it is more web focused. Okay,
because I don't know. It seems to me like the history of design tools has been like, there's some design tool is the king, and then something comes along and eats its lunch. Like, we heard earlier about Quark back in the day. And, then Photoshop was king, and then we got Sketch, right? And then Figma ate Sketch's lunch. And maybe it's time, something's going to eat Figma's lunch. Maybe it could be Figma itself. Like maybe Figma splits into being multiple tools for different environments. Could you see that happening?
Maybe. I can't really speak to the future, so don't really know where it's going to go. I think we're primarily focused on that area of product design and building apps. So we're going to be investing in those different areas, like anything around sort of like that design process. We launched FigJam, which is around like the ideation part of it as well, and we're invested in things like prototyping and as well. So I think we'll probably continue to do that as long as it makes sense in that design process.
I want to talk about that as well, because not Figma specifically, but the visual design process to me seems like sometimes we get it exactly wrong, in that we start in a very high fidelity tool, whether that's Figma or Sketch or Photoshop, whatever, some graphic design tool. And then once we've got sign off or whatever, everyone's agreed, we kind of have to then reproduce that, build that up in a separate language, and that. If it's almost like you should begin with broad brushstrokes, like saying prototyping, and get more high fidelity as you go along. Does that resonate?
I think it depends what kind of designer you are as well, though. For me, I find it easier to design high fidelity just because that's just the way I'm used to doing it as a graphic design background and visual design background. And I also find that it helps to get more conviction in your ideas when people can see a fuller picture, especially if you're presenting it to product managers or leadership. They really resonate with like a high fidelity prototype because it's visual and they can buy into it and get the vision.
Sure.
Whereas if you're working with a PM, you can probably just do like a scrappy wireframe. I think it depends the context
who you're
sharing it with.
But really what you're doing is you're making a promise, like, the end result will look like this, but you're not showing them it in the medium that it will end up in. You're showing it in a different medium. And then is there inevitably going to be disappointment? The people you made the promise to, they're disappointed when the final thing doesn't look quite like that. The devs are disappointed because you designed something that's really hard to actually accomplish and you should have consulted them first. And the designer's disappointed because the final thing doesn't look like the mock-up, damn it.
I think so the thing not looking like the thing you created, I think is more of like a problem maybe with designer mindset and the role of design, I guess. I think I used to get really frustrated in working in design agencies because I'd do this like really nice website design and I'd hand it over to a developer and then they'd say, hey, it's implemented now, check it out. And I'd look at it and like, that's just like nothing like what I just gave to you. How can you not see that that's not the same? Like the spacing is clearly not the same between here and here. And they'd be like, oh yeah, I didn't notice that. And then I'd be like, I'd spend so much more time like investing in trying to correct my spec and then handing it back over to the developer. But the reality is, no matter how much I put into this design spec, that's not the thing that people are going to see and experience. So that's not the thing that you should worth, spending your time in. At the end of the day, the source of truth is code, because that's what people see, that's what people use and experience. So really what you should be doing is going to the developer, working closely with them, understanding why that isn't working the way as intended. Maybe there's some like technical reason why. Maybe, we have these nice components in our Figma design system, but in code, they actually are a mess to use and they're more difficult to use. So we have to design around that. So instead of designing around, feeling like you're the owner of design, be more of a partner with a developer and work in their medium.
Bring them in early?
Yeah, and bring them in early as well so they can even detect those issues.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think a lot of time we try to solve problems with technical solutions when actually it's about people.
Yeah.
Have a conversation. So, I mean, what about situations where the designer and developer aren't necessarily in the same room or building or country?
Yeah.
Does it get a lot harder then?
Yeah, it does get a lot harder, I think. So that kind of process, from what I've seen in research, is what you would call more of like a formal handoff. So I guess it's like that waterfall kind of approach that we might be familiar with. And in this scenario, product decisions and design decisions is typically owned by design and by product managers. And engineers only typically see the like designs once they're ready to be implemented. So this can be a bit confusing and a bit annoying because you hand it over to a developer and they're like, hang on a second, that's going to take like 3 months to implement. And then you say, well, that's the design we have to do. And then they have to go and implement it. And then the designer might be like, oh, hang on a second, maybe we should change something. So then you have to sort of go through another formal process of like requesting a change. And then the developer has to like add that onto the end. So it can be quite annoying. But I think working around that, I think it's really important probably to, if you aren't in contact with developers at the start, document all the decisions around the design, like explain why you've got to that decision, explain, if you've had conversations, take notes and share those notes as well, so they can really understand, the reason for it, because they might come back to you and say, like, that's going to take 3 months to implement. It doesn't make sense to do that. But if they have the reasoning behind it and understand the decision and the journey of how you got there, then they might be probably more willing to do it. It still might not make sense, but at least they'll have an understanding of why you got there.
Yeah, we talk a lot about design systems these days, and I think people often confuse that with the components, the pieces. But actually, the system is how things are done. Like you say, the reasoning behind the design decision is actually much more valuable for a developer to know than the number of pixels or the hex value of a color. How do you document that stuff, though? Do you do that in the design tool? Do you do it in a separate place?
I think it depends. So at Figma, we document a lot of like our design tokens and stuff. We have it in like a huge spreadsheet. We obviously have it in the design system as well, just like all the different names and things like that. And our spreadsheet does match with what we have in code. But I've seen like other developers use, for components, things like that, they use Storybook as a way to sort of like reference to see what designs they have in code. And I think you can link that to a Figma file somehow.
But you're still talking about the outputs, even if you're talking about the design tokens, you're talking about values,
Yeah.
right? This number, that hex value. But I'm talking about, like, suppose there's the thinking behind a design decision was the border color should always be 10% lighter than the background color, something like that.
Yeah.
Some relationship. Now, that doesn't translate to a design token. That doesn't translate to the end value.
No, that's true, yeah.
How do you communicate those kind of, this is my thought process? So that if the developer one day has to make a new button and the designer's not around, they at least know the underlying rules, I guess.
Yeah. At Figma, we have some sort of like color guides on this that explain the reason why like a certain color is a certain color. So, for example, if you're working in light mode, then the shade of blue is slightly darker. But if you're in dark mode, it's slightly lighter, and that's for like accessibility reasons. And we've sort of created a Figma file it's like presented quite nicely in like as a document format, and it sort of just shows visual examples of this, so we can share that with whoever's working on the project.
So the designers love to complain that the devs just don't get it. They built this thing, it looks nothing like the thing I designed. Meanwhile, the devs love to complain like, the designers don't understand the medium we're working in. Why did they design that? It doesn't work like that on the web. How do we get a better collaboration between designers, a better understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dream that everyone wants to work in is this like collaborative style of handoff. I think when we think of handoff, like the first thing that probably comes to mind is like anxiety, just because everyone probably hates the process slightly, but maybe doesn't want to admit it. But I think we really want to get to this more collaborative state, which is what we try to work at Figma as well. So we try to bring our developers in really early. So even if we're writing like a PRD, a product document on an idea, we'll share it around with designers, product managers, developers as well. And that way we sort of spark different design ideas. You know, we get some early feasibility assessments as well from the start, which can actually help to then shape the feature that we're going to build too. And you know, the developer and the designer feel ownership already because they've made some contribution. And then when the designer's sort of going to explore, or at least when I do this, if we do design crits where we want to get design feedback, I also try to invite the engineers in as well and get them involved in the design process too. So then I ask them to even like, you know, riff and take this design and feel free to like change it around if you have any different ideas, or leave a bunch of comments on the file. I really want to try and bring them in closer to the design process. And then it's the same when you sort of working in, I guess, like the handoff part. Instead of just like spending time doing a design spec and then passing it over to a developer thinking your job's done. No, don't do that. If you can, if you're in the scenario where you work with developers in-house, bring them in, you know, walk through the spec with them, have a sort of like a conversation about it, you know, ask them, like even maybe write estimates about like what's the priority here and things like that. Help like take a bit more of a developer mindset in terms of breaking things down instead of just thinking this has to ship as one big thing. And if you start to have that developer mindset, then you'll start to probably have empathy for, you know, or even compassion, as we talked about yesterday, for what they're experiencing and how they work as well.
Still feels like there's a bit of a power dynamic going on there where, you know, it begins with the designer and then, you know, you're trying to see it faithfully through with the developer in service to the design. But couldn't it just as easily work the other way? Again, talking about, you know, begin with a prototype, begin with the rough brush strokes in the browser, in CSS and HTML, and then, you know, bring the designer in later to make it look pretty.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I wouldn't say make it look pretty, but yeah. That's definitely happened at Figma. So some developers that I've worked with, in fact, a lot of developers I work with, because they're all used to using Figma and, you know, we dog food our own projects, so we use it all the time ourselves. They'll just like throw up a prototype and be like, hey, I had this really cool idea. What if we did this? Share it in Slack. And then we would build, like designers would get introduced, give feedback. So they're playing the role of designer. And we're sort of like the developer partner in terms of helping them to develop their idea and sort of make it a bit more refined and things like that. So we do try and do that as well. We do encourage that as well. It's not always about like who owns design. It's more about who can contribute and bring ideas.
Yeah, yeah. And then when you see the partnership, when you see a designer and developer that get one another, working together, it is magical.
Yeah.
Who has questions for Joel?
Oh, we got one back there. We got one up here too. We'll get to you in just a sec.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, good.
You touched on concepting, and this is a very real challenge right now for both our design and development teams. Is how do you bring that developer mindset into concepting? Like that's something that I think we're trying to scratch at a little bit more. It seems like there is a bit of, I don't want to call it tension, but there is a back and forth and a push and pull. But you've said a few things, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the concepting phase.
Yeah, sure. So if I say my designer working on an idea, instead of trying to think like maybe from the developer mindset, I think it would be better to sort of like share those early scrappy ideas often with a developer and get feedback on them, and just, you know, be really intentional saying like, this is just like a crazy idea that I have. I don't know how feasible this is, but maybe, you know, if you have some inclination or some idea of like maybe we could reuse this code, and maybe we could reuse that code. It's good to like bring up that during concepting, because they can actually like help you to clarify, like, oh yeah, it looks like we can do that, but actually we can't for this technical reason.
Isn't there also, I mean, to push back a bit on that, there's divergent phases and there's convergent phases, right? We're talking about double diamond. And during the concepting, if it is about, there's no bad ideas, right? It's all yes and, never any no buts. Maybe that's not the time for a developer to go, hang on, that's technically impossible to implement. Wait until you get to the convergent phase, where it's like, okay, now developers, tell us why we can't do this, and tell us.
Well, I think it also depends on the project as well, like if on the scope and the deadline. There's times to think blue sky, and then there's times to think like, what can we do in like 2 weeks?
Yeah.
So in that sense, if it's like a short deadline, maybe it does make more sense to like bring a developer in and say like, is this a terrible idea, like, in the sense of time? But if you're thinking of like a whole new experience or something, then yeah, you should probably go as wide as possible and maybe not think like a developer in terms of what's feasible, but think more from like a vision perspective, and like, how can we create like a great experience or a great product?
It seems to be what the developer brings to the table is a sense of what's expensive and what's cheap. In other words, like, you can have that, but it's going to take ages. Whereas if you design it this way, it's, we can get that out the door in 2 days. And that's a really valuable thing to know.
Yeah.
We'll get a microphone to the front here. We have a question.
What do you think about using such tools as Framer, Webflow that doesn't require companies to write code, especially if you're talking about designing simple marketing websites? What are the advantages and disadvantages of using Framer and Webflow?
Yeah, I think you pointed it out that you don't need to use code. So I've used Webflow and Framer for like some freelance work, and it's been really good for just being able to sort of like own the complete process. I think one disadvantage of those tools is that maybe they're not really focused on exploration as much. You definitely can just like start from scratch and use that tool and build in it. But I find it personally that it's easier to sort of explore in like Figma, or maybe even like just a different tool, sketch something out, and then translate that to Webflow when I've got some like more structure. I know what my components are. I know which parts I'm going to reuse and things like that.
This is interesting that you'd use the same tool for kind of different purposes, in the sense that you're talking about, doing something quite high fidelity because you're trying to get sign off. You're trying to, show someone higher up that this will look awesome. And so you make the mock-up, and then you get sign off. And then that same mock-up is handed to a developer. And that's a very different use case. Like I say, the developer one should actually be designed with a developer in mind, with the annotations and the documentation. And yet it seems like the same tool is being used for very different, or the same mock-up, the same file is being used to satisfy very different needs.
I mean, I'm not saying that you should design something that is impossible to do and implement. I'm saying that, yeah.
But the audience is different, I guess is what I'm saying. Designing for sign-off and designing for a developer to build, those are two very different audiences.
Yeah, that's true. I think you just need to be clear about when you're designing for the sign-off that, the details of this aren't necessarily figured out. I think that's really key to communicate, so that they don't expect that to look exactly the same. I think it's important to flag that, this is the high-level concept, and this is like the experience we want to get to in the long term. But we're not promising it's going to look exactly like this.
Yeah. We might have time for one quick question before we wrap up. No questions? Oh, one. What? Knife fight. You win.
Hopefully this is something you can answer. Obviously you'll probably might turn around and say we can't really talk about it because it's not released yet, but obviously Figma acquired by Adobe. Congratulations.
Yeah, let's just not talk about that.
So
No, seriously, if your question is about that.
No.
Okay, good.
So obviously with Figma constantly evolving and through prototyping, FigJam, the tools within the actual product always getting upgraded, like auto layout. There has been a lot of experts in the Figma tool world who've developed strategies to hack their way around to provide features that aren't actually in the platform yet. And a lot of that's quite time consuming for them themselves, but also to then learn how to apply that to a big broad design system. And obviously, if that becomes redundant or it's phased out with Figma bringing in new features like the new kind of nesting and such, is it pointless to look towards these high fidelity hacks because Figma will eventually deliver these things for designers? Or is it just like, because obviously if you apply something and it breaks the whole design system, and then Figma comes out with a new thing, you have to go, oh guys, we have to go back to the design system and spend all this maintenance time. Is it one of these things with AI being integrated that we won't need to worry about features that aren't there because they'll start rolling out rapidly? Or is it still, 5-10 years out where we still need to manually hack our way through features that aren't actually there?
Yeah, I think it depends on like the specific feature that you're talking about. In terms of like, I guess I give the example of when we had variants and then we introduced component props. Like there was a huge gap between that time. So, unfortunately you did just have to create loads of variants at the time, and it wouldn't be worth as a company just waiting and hoping that, Figma introduces component props to then think, okay, now we'll do it. Because the reality is that there's always going to be feature requests, there's always going to be improvements made. But if it's something that's blocking your team, you should probably just find a way to solve it, unless it's like a really bad hack. So, for example, when we had auto layout, people were creating these like hack frames to recreate absolute positioning. And that's really bad for developer collaboration, because when they use the inspect tool and see that, the inspect panel and see that, they will then click on it and then see like, what's this like random like 1 pixel frame, and then see that it's like positioned in a really weird way. So it can have like knock-on effects for developer collaboration. But yeah, for something that, that's important, that is blocking your team, it might be worth just investing in the hack.
For now. It sounds a lot like CSS, where like the hacks work for a while.
Just on the topic of features, by the way, as well. So I do get a lot of feature request questions. So I thought it might be a great idea if anyone has a feature request, just scan the QR code and please leave your name and type any request that you want, and I'll try and get back to you.
Instead of bugging Joel. All right, thank you very much, Joel Miller.
Thank you.